Reckland, Germany. Winter 1943. The hangar smelled like oil, cigarettes, and winning. Around a long table covered with drawings, four German Air Force engineers leaned over a new spy report marked U.S. Army Air Force's engine type 1650. One of them, Chief Engineer Franz Muller, fixed his wire-rimmed glasses and laughed. Packard Motor Company, he said, reading the stamped logo on the photograph. The Americans have copied the Merlin. They build fancy cars, and now they think they can build a Rolls-Royce. The others joined in with quiet laughter. Outside, the cold wind howled across the airfield, shaking the metal walls, but inside, the warmth of confidence filled the room. To the Germans, engines were special. Perfection was not put together. It was carefully made. Every bolt on a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine had the mark of a man who had filed it by hand, adjusted it by listening, and measured its balance with his fingertips. To them, perfection lived in the fingers of craftsmen, not in the rhythm of a machine. The Packard name, known for American cars driven by businessmen and movie stars, sounded to them like a joke, not a danger. Muller turned another page. The spy summary was direct. The United States plans to produce 50,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines with permission for use in fighter planes. He breathed out through his nose. They cannot even produce enough mechanics to take care of them, and they expect to build 50,000. Behind him, his assistant, Carl, flicked ash from his cigarette and replied, "Mass production kills perfection." It was a phrase repeated so often in German engineering circles that it had become a rule. Every Spitfire they had examined had a Merlin that sang with tiny imperfections, each cylinder tuned by listening, each valve, spring, slightly different. It was a living engine made by craftsmen who worked by feeling. How could a machine shop in Detroit copy that? They remembered the reports from North Africa and the English Channel. American aircraft were heavy, rough, and loud. Their bombers lost fuel. Their engines leaked oil. Their mechanics used hammers where German engineers used tiny measuring tools. The Germans respected the Americans for their resources, not for their skill. They build in tons, not in tiny measurements, Muller said. He tapped the paper with a pencil. This is what happens when you let businessmen build engines. The room erupted again in laughter, but the report had something they could not ignore. The Americans had taken the British blueprints and redrawn them completely using their own standards. Every thread, every gasket, every bearing changed into a different measurement system. To the Germans, that was crazy. "They will ruin it," Carl muttered. "Change millimeters to inches, destroy the clearances, melt pistons, seize bearings." Muller nodded in agreement. "They will copy the shape, not the function." He wrote in the margin, "Copy equals worse by design." Outside, the sound of a Messerschmitt starting up echoed through the airfield. The DB605 roared alive with that special mechanical snarl, a sound every German pilot trusted more than his own heartbeat. Muller turned toward the noise and smiled. "You see, that's how an engine should sound. Hand-built, alive, pure." He closed the American file and snapped the leather strap across it. "If they ever face us with these Packard toys, we'll burn them from the sky." What Muller didn't know was that across the Atlantic in a huge brick factory beside the Detroit River, those so-called toys were already running smoothly, endlessly, identically. He couldn't imagine an engine that didn't need a craftsman to make it sing. He couldn't imagine an assembly line capable of harmony. In Germany, perfection was art. In America, perfection was math. That night, Muller wrote his thoughts in his logbook. "American arrogance continues," he wrote. "They believe machines can replace men. They believe quantity can replace quality. They may have factories, but we have engineers." He underlined the last sentence twice. Years later, when historians found that notebook, the ink had faded, but the irony had not. The men who believed machines could never equal their craftsmanship were about to be defeated by machines that produced perfection by the thousands. But in 1943, they couldn't see it. They saw only the blueprints of a copy and laughed. If you believe those engineers were right, that mass production destroys quality, hit like. But if you think they were wrong, that true genius lies in building perfection for everyone, not just for the few. comment the number 7. Derby, England, early 1940. The war had barely begun, but inside the brick walls of the Rolls-Royce factory, it already sounded like forever. Hammers sang against aluminum. Tiny measuring tools clicked in steady rhythm, and the air shimmered with the heat of hard work. The Merlin engine, 12 cylinders of British defiance, was being born one breath, one heartbeat at a time. To those who built it, the Merlin was not machinery. It was music made of metal. In the assembly bay, a craftsman named Harold Watkins stood over a half-finished crankcase. He'd been with Rolls-Royce since the 1930s, long before the word war filled the newspapers. His fingers, rough from a lifetime of filing metal, moved like a surgeon's. Every stroke of the file was a conversation between man and material. He whispered numbers as he worked. Thousandths of an inch, degrees of alignment, moments of balance. The gauge read 0.00005. He smiled. Perfect. The Merlin was not designed for mass production. It was designed to last forever. At 27 liters, it weighed 1,640 pounds and produced 1,500 horsepower at full throttle. An orchestra of pistons, valves, and gears spinning in perfect harmony. Each engine used more than 1,000 hours of human work. Every part came with its own quirks and secrets. Slight differences in the metal, small differences in the machining. Rolls-Royce engineers didn't fight those imperfections. They tuned them like a violin maker adjusting strings by ear. When the first Spitfire took flight with a Merlin under its hood, Britain discovered that sound could carry courage. Pilots said they could feel the engine breathe with them, respond like a living creature. At full boost, the propeller blurred to invisibility, the cockpit shaking with the pulse of 12 pistons firing 150 times per second. The engine's growl became the anthem of survival during the Battle of Britain. In pubs across London, men would swear that the Merlin's hum could be heard miles away, a metallic heartbeat promising that the island still lived. Rolls-Royce guarded its masterpiece like a secret religion. In the design offices, blueprints were hand-drawn in black ink on linen paper, each marked property of His Majesty's government. To change even one tolerance required approval from a board of senior engineers. When a new apprentice asked why no two engines seemed identical, his mentor replied, "Because they are not made by machines. They are made by men." News of the Merlin's success spread quickly, even to enemy intelligence. The Germans called it the Spitfire engine, the heart of the plane that turned their daylight raids into burning wrecks. But while they studied its performance with grudging respect, they still dismissed its production as old-fashioned. Rolls-Royce could build brilliance, but not abundance. Every Merlin demanded the hands of master craftsmen. Every aircraft required months of waiting. The Germans had already built thousands of Messerschmitts powered by the DB601 and DB605 engines that rolled off assembly lines in numbers Britain could never match. By 1941, that math had become deadly. British factories were working 20-hour days, yet fighter output barely kept pace with losses. Every engine was precious. When one failed, a pilot's life often ended in fire. In Derby, mechanics wept when a damaged Merlin returned to the hangar. They would touch the scorched metal like mourners at a funeral, whispering, "She tried her best." The Merlin was more than machinery. It was personality, loyalty, sacrifice. And that devotion was both its strength and its curse. Across the Atlantic, American observers toured the factory, notebooks in hand, eyes wide with disbelief. To them, this was genius trapped in amber. Hand-fitted valves, custom ground cams, variations so subtle that no two engines could swap parts. One American engineer from Packard reportedly asked, "How do you expect to win a war building engines like violins?" The Rolls-Royce foreman answered quietly, "Because ours play the right tune." That answer summed up the British philosophy of engineering. Craftsmanship as patriotism, precision as poetry. But poetry could not fill the skies fast enough. By 1942, the Royal Air Force was begging for thousands of engines it couldn't yet build. And that desperation led to an idea almost no one in Derby wanted to accept: handing the Merlin's blueprints to America. when word reached the shop floor that Packard Motor Company in Detroit would begin making Merlins under license. Many workers felt insulted. One machinist slammed his wrench on the bench and muttered, "They'll ruin it. Americans make cars, not engines fit for heaven." Another replied, "They'll drown it in oil and call it progress." Even some executives doubted it could be done. Rolls-Royce engineers measured tolerances in fractions of a human hair. Packard measured in fractions of minutes. But war has a way of forcing humility. The Spitfire and the Lancaster could not wait for pride. The United States had factories larger than entire English towns, and their machines could stamp, mill, and grind faster than any human hand. The only question was whether speed could live with soul. By the summer of 1942, wooden crates filled with drawings left Derby for Detroit. 21,000 blueprints, each one a piece of British genius crossing an ocean. The craftsmen watched them go, half proud, half afraid. They didn't yet know that in a matter of months, the Americans would return those blueprints transformed, not by art, but by math. If you believe a masterpiece loses its soul when it leaves the hands of its maker, press like. But if you believe that true genius can survive translation, that art can become industry without losing beauty, comment the number 7. Detroit, Michigan, autumn 1942. The night sky glowed orange above the Packard Motor Car Company, not from bombs or fire, but from the furnace of creation. The factory ran 24 hours a day, its brick walls shaking with the pulse of war. Inside, the sound was constant, steel stamping, rivet guns hammering, engines roaring on test stands. America had entered the war, and Detroit had become the heart of its mechanical army. Packard had been known for luxury cars, smooth engines, polished with dashboards, silent rides for the wealthy. But when the government called, the company answered. The United States had promised Britain not just weapons, but miracles in quantity. They needed to mass-produce the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the most advanced aircraft engine in the world, and they needed to do it at American speed. At first, even Packard's engineers hesitated. The blueprints that arrived from Derby were a riddle written in another language. Measurements in fractions, tolerances in decimals, threads in Whitworth instead of SE. Rolls-Royce drawings were elegant but chaotic. Handwritten notes, secret symbols known only to the draftsmen who made them. Packard's lead engineer, Jesse Vincent, stared at the mountain of paper and said quietly, "If we build this the British way, we'll build one engine a month. We need to build one every hour." The challenge was not just technical. It was about beliefs. Rolls-Royce believed in perfection through craftsmanship. Packard believed in perfection through process. In Britain, a single craftsman adjusted every valve by hand. In Detroit, machines did not trust feelings. They trusted gauges. So Packard redrew every blueprint from scratch. 21,000 in total, translated from artistry into math. Where Rolls-Royce wrote, "Fits snug," Packard wrote, "Clearance 0.0012 plus 0.0001 inches." For months, engineers worked without rest. They standardized threads, bearings, and fittings so that every part could fit every engine. They designed jigs that held parts so precisely that human error vanished from the equation. They built calibration tools that measured tolerances finer than the width of a red blood cell. And then they began the most ambitious industrial experiment of the war, to build genius by assembly line. In one huge hall, rows of women in coveralls worked under the glare of bright lamps. Each specialized in a single operation, grinding, honing, inspecting, tightening, each movement timed to seconds. A supervisor carried a stopwatch and a clipboard. The clang of wrenches formed a rhythm, mechanical yet strangely human. When an engine block reached the end of the line, another worker slid in its place. There was no silence, no pause, no delay. To observers, it was overwhelming. A visitor from the British Air Ministry wrote in his report, "It is like watching an orchestra where every instrument is made of steel." The engines gleamed under bright lights. Aluminum, brass, steel, born not from hands but from precision tools. Each part identical to the one before it. Interchangeable, replaceable, perfect by repetition. But not everyone believed it would work. British advisors doubted that mass production could match their handcrafted tolerances. One senior Rolls-Royce engineer muttered, "They'll build fast, yes, but they'll build wrong." Jesse Vincent disagreed. He told his team, "We're not just building engines. We're building a new kind of perfection, one that anyone, anywhere can repeat." Packard introduced quality control steps that had never existed in British plants. Every part passed through 3 separate inspections. Every measurement was logged in decimal precision. Workers were trained not to adjust by instinct, but to trust instruments. In Derby, that would have been heresy. In Detroit, it was progress. By December 1942, the first prototype, called the V1650, sat on a dynamometer stand. When the ignition switch turned, the engine came alive with a sound no one expected. Smooth, even, steady. The vibration that had haunted the early British Merlin was gone. At full throttle, the Packard engine purred like it had been carved from a single block of metal. Reporters were invited to witness the first test run. In the observation room, a British attaché whispered, "It runs smoother than ours." He meant it as disbelief, not praise. But the data confirmed it. The Packard Merlin delivered the same power with lower fuel use, fewer leaks, and longer life. Its clearances were so uniform that bearings could be swapped between engines without a single adjustment. Detroit had done what no one thought possible. It had turned the most complex handmade engine on Earth into an industrial product. Within 6 months, Packard could build a Merlin every 60 minutes. Each engine cost less, lasted longer, and required fewer mechanics to service. Precision had been democratized. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, British factories watched in amazement as the first American-built Merlin arrived. They fit perfectly into Spitfires and Mosquitoes, bolted on without change. Pilots reported the same thrust, the same sound, but fewer failures. Rolls-Royce engineers examined the engines in silence. The parts had strange markings, Packard serial numbers, American fonts, but they were flawless. When the first Packard Merlin reached North American aviation, they were mounted on a new airframe called the P-51 Mustang. The combination was magic. With the Merlin's high-altitude supercharger, the Mustang leapt to 437 miles per hour, outrunning and outclimbing anything Germany could send against it. What began as a copy had become a legend. Inside the Packard plant, Jesse Vincent walked the line as hundreds of engines thundered on test stands. He turned to his foreman and said, "You hear that? That's what victory sounds like." The foreman nodded. "It sounds like Detroit." In Recland, the German engineers who had once mocked the American license now received new spy reports. They read that American factories were producing 500 Merlins a week. Muller, the same engineer who had laughed over the blueprints, stared at the figures in disbelief. 50,000 engines, he whispered. They build them like toys. But these toys would soon fill the skies over Europe. Across oceans, across languages, a new philosophy had emerged. In Britain, craftsmanship had created brilliance. In America, standardization had made it unstoppable. The Packard Merlin was no longer an imitation. It was evolution by math. If you believe perfection belongs only to human hands, press like. But if you believe perfection can be multiplied, shared, and built by thousands of ordinary people working in harmony, comment the number 7. Dearborn, Michigan, January 1943. The snow outside was silent, but inside the Packard test facility, the air trembled. Dozens of engineers stood behind thick glass windows, staring at the dynamometer bay. A single Merlin engine, gleaming chrome bright, every bolt engraved with Packard Motor Division, Detroit, USA, sat chained to its test stand like a caged animal. On the control board, red lights flickered. The operator raised his hand. "Contact," he said. The ignition key turned. The first cough of combustion cracked the silence. Then a roar. Clean, steady, perfect. The 12 cylinders came alive, not with the rasping snarl of a British test stand, but with a deep, balanced hum that filled the building like an organ. For the first 20 seconds, no one spoke. Then Jesse Vincent exhaled, the tension breaking. She runs. But running was not enough. The test had to prove more than motion. This engine would be pushed to 500 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute for 150 consecutive hours without a single seizure, leak, or failure. It was a trial Rolls-Royce had never dared to attempt. If Packard's copy survived, it would silence every doubt on 2 continents. Hour after hour, the engine thundered. Technicians rotated in shifts, measuring vibration, oil temperature, bearing clearances. At 30 hours, the British observers began to relax. At 70 hours, one of them muttered, "It'll quit soon." They all do. At 120 hours, they stopped guessing. And at 150 hours, when the engine shut down, it was still within 1% of its original performance. The numbers were undeniable. Power output stable, compression perfect, fuel efficiency higher than any previous Merlin. Jesse Vincent turned to the visiting Rolls-Royce liaison and said softly, "You still think we can't mass-produce art?" The man hesitated, then smiled in disbelief. "I think you just did." The results crossed the Atlantic in coded cables. At Derby, the message landed like thunder. Packard test successful. Engine passed 150 hours full power. No defects. For a moment, the factory floor fell silent. Some men were proud. Others were ashamed. One senior designer said, "They have taken our genius and made it reproducible." Another simply nodded and whispered, "Good, then maybe we'll win this war." By spring 1943, Packard was shipping hundreds of engines a month. Each one identical, interchangeable, serialized. Mechanics in England could swap parts between aircraft without adjustment. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. The American-built Merlins started cleaner, ran cooler, and climbed higher. They were less temperamental, more obedient. They had lost the romance of the hand-built engine, but gained something more valuable: reliability. The true test came when North American Aviation installed the Packard Merlin into the P-51 Mustang. On April 30th, 1943, the prototype roared down the runway at Inglewood, California. Test pilot Bob Chilton pulled back the stick, and the silver aircraft leapt into the air. The combination was electrifying. The Merlin's supercharger sang as the Mustang climbed past 30,000 feet in minutes. At 25,000 feet, the air thinned, but the engine didn't falter. At 35,000, it still pulled hard. Chilton radioed ground control, laughing through the oxygen mask. "Gentlemen, I think we just changed the war." Within months, the new P-51B entered service. It was fast, long-legged, deadly. It could escort bombers deep into Germany, strike at targets no Allied fighter had ever reached, and still have the fuel to come home. German pilots who once mocked American planes as clumsy and overweight now faced opponents that flew higher, faster, and seemingly endless. The Luftwaffe had entered an unwinnable race against numbers and altitude. In July 1943, near Bremen, a formation of B-17 bombers flew under P-51 escort for the first time. From the ground, German spotters reported new aircraft, unknown type, very high altitude, extreme speed. When the first Messerschmitts climbed to intercept, they found themselves already under attack. One German pilot, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Moritz, later described the encounter. "They came out of the sun. I thought they were Spitfires, but they kept climbing higher than any Spitfire ever could. I hit full throttle. They were still above me. Then the tracers came down like lightning." After the battle, fragments of a crashed P-51 were recovered by German engineers. They pried open the cowling, expecting to find the familiar British stamp. Instead, the words on the data plate stunned them: Packard Motor Division, Detroit, USA. The same city that once built limousines was now building death from the sky. One engineer ran his hand over the smooth casting of the cylinder head and muttered, "They have improved it. Damn them, they've improved it." By late 1943, the Packard Merlin had become the beating heart of Allied air power. Not only Mustangs, but also Mosquitoes and Lancasters flew with American-built engines. The statistics were brutal. Mission range increased by 60%, escort losses dropped by half, and operational readiness climbed above 90%. The Luftwaffe's nightmare wasn't just the aircraft. It was the endless supply of engines that kept coming. In Germany, reports piled up on the desk of General Field Marshal Erhard Milch. Intelligence estimated that American factories were producing Merlins faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Milch underlined one sentence in red pencil: enemy industrial capacity now beyond measurable limits. He looked up and said to his aide, "They have turned engineering into warfare." Meanwhile, in Detroit, the factory lights never dimmed. Welders worked under the rhythmic glare of sparks. Inspectors checked gauges against master templates. Women on the assembly lines wore badges marked Merlin Division. Every 6 minutes, a new engine rolled off the line. When a visiting journalist asked a foreman what kept them going, he pointed to a wall of photographs, pilots standing beside Mustangs, and said, "Every picture is one we keep alive." The transformation was complete. The same American industry that once built luxury cars for peace now built precision for survival. The Packard Merlin had begun as a copy, dismissed by its enemies, doubted by its allies, and born under pressure. But it ended as proof that America's greatest weapon was not steel or speed. It was system. Across the ocean, the German engineers who had laughed over the blueprints a year earlier now read reports of P-51s tearing through bomber formations at 30,000 feet. Muller, the man who once wrote, "Copy equals inferior by design," tore the page from his notebook. He couldn't bring himself to burn it. He only stared at the torn paper and whispered, "It seems we were the copy all along." If you believe real genius is measured not by how something is built, but by how many lives it can save, comment the number 7. If you think perfection dies the moment it leaves the craftsman's hands, press like. Either way, history has already answered. Reckland Airfield, Germany, December 1943. The morning fog hung low, thick enough to swallow the sound of distant engines. In a hangar lit by dim bulbs, a group of Luftwaffe engineers stood around the twisted wreck of an aircraft they had never seen before. Its fuselage was silver, its wings long and thin, the skin smooth as glass. The nose had been sheared open by impact, revealing the heart of the machine. An engine so cleanly machined, so symmetrical, that for a moment no one spoke. Oberingenieur Franz Muller, the same man who had once laughed at the idea of an American-built Merlin, crouched near the wreckage. The metal still held the faint smell of oil and burned glycol. On the fractured data plate, the words were still readable: Packard Motor Division, Detroit, USA. He touched the engraving with a gloved finger. His voice was quiet. "So, this is it," he murmured. "The copy." They began taking apart the engine in silence. Tools clicked and clattered against aluminum. When the first cylinder head came off, they froze. Every surface was mirror smooth. The tolerances exact, the machining flawless. Carl, his assistant, bent closer and ran a caliper across a bearing journal. 2 microns difference, he whispered. "That's impossible. Ours vary by 20. Muller nodded slowly. "They don't build engines," he said. "They build measurements." He lifted a connecting rod and stared at it like an artifact. "Rolls-Royce shaped this by hand," he said. "But these," he held it under the lamp, "these were born identical. Each one perfect, each one the same." On the wall behind them, a chalkboard filled with earlier intelligence reports still had the words P-51 Mustang, new Allied fighter. They had underestimated it, assuming it to be another short-range interceptor. But now the wreckage told a different story. The Merlin engine, reborn in America, had given it the reach to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The war in the air was no longer about tactics. It was about endurance. Later that afternoon, they gathered in the observation bunker to review combat footage recovered from forward units. The projector flickered to life, showing German gun camera film from a Focke-Wulf 190. In the grainy black and white frames, a silver aircraft dove from above, too fast to track. Tracers arced upward, missing wildly. Then, in the next second, the Mustang opened fire. A clean, bright burst of light, and the film ended in smoke. "Impossible," one officer said. "No piston engine climbs like that." Muller shook his head. "It's the supercharger. 2 stages, 2 speeds." At altitude, it breathes as if it were on the ground. He pointed at the data from recovered wrecks. They solved cooling. They solved pressure. They solved everything. A mechanic entered carrying a small box. Inside were fragments of ball bearings recovered from the engine. Still round, the man said, after the crash. Muller examined one under a magnifying lens. The bearing surfaces were polished to perfection. They didn't polish these by hand, he said. They polished them by math. The mood in the hangar shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then to something quieter, respect. The men who had mocked Detroit now understood what they were facing. Packard hadn't just copied Rolls-Royce. They had created an engine that could be built faster, run longer, and survive where precision once depended on luck. Word spread quickly through Luftwaffe circles. Pilots began reporting the new American fighter. Long range, high altitude, nearly unstoppable. They called it Der Silberner Jäger, the Silver Hunter. It appeared without warning, dove-like lightning, and vanished before radar could track it. One ace described it in his diary. It comes from above, silent until it fires. The tracers arrive first, then the roar. You feel like you've been hunted by math. By early 1944, intelligence briefings included detailed comparisons between the German DB-605 and the American Packard Merlin. The DB-605 was lighter and more compact, but required constant maintenance, exact fuel, and careful handling. The Merlin could run dirty, overheat, cool itself, and keep going. One report concluded bitterly, "Our engines are racehorses. Theirs are machines built to win wars." When the first captured P-51s arrived intact after forced landings in occupied France, engineers finally had a full specimen to study. They rolled it into the test bay, washed the mud from its wings, and removed the cowling. The craftsmanship was so clean it looked surgical. Even the wiring looms were labeled and color-coded, a sign of design for the unbreakable, not the beautiful. Carl handed Muller a typed summary of test results. He read it twice, then set it down. Superior oil pressure stability, superior temperature control, superior material fatigue, identical compression across all cylinders. He paused, then added quietly, "They have done what we thought only a craftsman could do." That night, Muller returned to his quarters and opened his old logbook, the one that still had his note from 1942, "Copy equals inferior by design." He stared at the line for a long time, then crossed it out with a single stroke of his pencil. Below it, he wrote, "Perfection is not an accident. It is a system." Outside, the distant rumble of bombers rolled across the horizon, the sound of American industry at work.